All right, you folks in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena, are you ready for a deep dive?
Sounds good.
We're talking about something that's right in our backyard, right here in Southeast Houston.
Yeah,
The forces that shape our local economy and really your prosperity.
absolutely. I mean, it may seem kind of like a distant topic, federal regulation,
Right.
but it really has roots in our community, impacting everything from the businesses on Main Street to the jobs available, at the port, at the refineries all around us.
Yeah. And we've been looking at some really interesting research from the Mises Institute that tells this by examining something called the Code of Federal Regulations,
Yeah.
the CFR.
Mm-hmm.
You can think of it kind of like the rule book for the federal government.
It is the rule book.
Right.
It's a massive rule book.
It is.
And what's really interesting is the way they've approached analyzing it. They've essentially tracked the size of this rule book over time, literally by counting the pages.
Really?
It's a very tangible way to see how federal regulatory activity has grown.
So our goal in this deep dive is to try to understand what this research reveals about how these regulations might be influencing our economic well-being right here at home.
Right here at home.
I mean, let's just get right to it. What's the core disagreement at the heart of all of this?
Well, at its base, you have two contrasting ideas about the role of government in the economy. One view is that government intervention through regulations is often necessary to ensure the common good and overall prosperity.
Okay.
So the argument is that sometimes the free market doesn't deliver the best outcomes for everyone, and you need rules
Right.
to correct those failures.
So that's one side.
And the other side is the free market perspective,
Right.
which this research we're talking about increasingly suggests that less government intervention actually leads to better economic results.
Now, this is making me think of those economic freedom rankings you see sometimes.
Yeah.
How do those rankings connect to this idea of regulation?
Well, they provide a broader picture. They assess how much economic freedom different countries have based
Right.
on various factors.
Okay.
And a very consistent finding from these studies is that countries with more economic freedom tend to have higher levels of wealth, stronger economic growth,
Wow.
and even greater income equality.
Really?
So when we look at the CFR specifically, we're really focusing on one key aspect of this broader idea of economic freedom,
Okay.
the extent of regulation.
Okay. So let's dive into this CFR page count. Why is that considered a meaningful way to understand the amount of federal regulation?
There's several reasons for that.
Mm.
First, the federal government is legally required to publish all its existing regulations in the CFR
Okay.
every year. It's meant to be a comprehensive record of all the rules,
So it's all in one place?
all in one place,
Yeah.
year after year.
Right.
Second, the CFR has been around since 1938,
Wow.
which gives us a really valuable data set
Yeah.
to analyze how regulation has changed over time
Yeah.
and to compare it with how the economy has performed.
So we're looking at a long-term trend here.
Right. We are looking at a long-term trend.
Yeah.
And the research also points out that other government publications either don't consistently measure the overall amount of regulation or they haven't been around as long as the CFR.
Now, someone listening in Pasadena might say, just counting pages doesn't tell us how tough those rules are to follow.
Right.
That seems like a fair point.
Yeah, no, it's a valid limitation. The number of pages doesn't directly measure how strictly regulations are enforced, but the researchers argue that because there are so many regulations,
Right.
and because they're looking over such a long period, changes in enforcement levels are likely to average out over time.
Okay.
Also, just the sheer volume of the rules in the CFR,
Yeah.
we're talking about books upon books.
Right.
It suggests a significant level of regulatory activity regardless of minor ups and downs in enforcement.
That makes sense in the big picture. So what did economist John W. Dawson discover when he examined this data and looked at the relationship between the CFR and how well the economy performs?
Well, his findings were quite striking. He found that a 1% increase in the amount of regulation compared to the amount of capital investment in the economy is associated with a 0.24% decrease in how efficiently that capital is used to produce things.
When you say capital productivity,
Yeah.
how does that impact us locally here?
Yeah, well, you can think of capital productivity as how well the businesses and industries here in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena use their resources, their equipment, their facilities
Right.
to create goods and services.
Right.
So a drop in capital productivity could mean that our local refineries or chemical plants, for example,
Right.
are getting less output for the same amount of investment, potentially leading to slower growth or fewer opportunities.
So more regulation seems to be linked to our local businesses being less efficient, What about specific kinds of regulations? Did he look at that?
Yeah, he did. He looked at different categories. And what's interesting is that certain areas of regulation showed a much more significant negative correlation with this output per unit of capital.
Hmm.
And these included things like commerce. That's Title 15 of the CFR Employee Benefits, Title 20, Foreign Relations, Title 22, Labor, Title 29, Public Health, Title 42, and Transportation, Title 49.
So that covers a lot of ground. How might those specific areas hit us here in Southeast Houston?
Well, consider transportation regulations.
Right.
Title 49, given the massive shipping and energy infrastructure along the Houston Ship Channel, changes in those rules could directly affect the efficiency and cost of moving goods,
Right.
impacting many of you listening who work in those sectors.
Yeah.
Labor regulations. Title 29 influence hiring workplace rules, the cost of employing people at local businesses,
Right.
public health regulations. Title 42, while important, can also create compliance costs for our healthcare providers and even some businesses.
Yeah.
And even rules about commerce can shape how local businesses compete and operate.
So it's not just abstract numbers. These regulations have real-world consequences for a local economy. What about the big picture, the long-term trends? What does the research say about that?
Well, Dawson's research suggests that the overall increase in regulation over the last half-century
Wow.
has likely had a considerable negative effect on our total economic output. It's not just a short-term blip. It seems to have slowed down the overall pace of economic growth over time.
That's concerning.
Yeah, and he even used the statistical method called quintegration analysis,
Okay.
which helps to identify long-term relationships between different factors.
Right.
And that analysis pointed to an even more substantial long-term impact of overall regulation on the economy,
Okay.
as well as a more significant long-term drag from those specific regulatory areas we just talked about.
So to sum this up, it seems like the takeaway here is that less regulation and more investment in things like local businesses and infrastructure are key to greater prosperity.
That's a good summary, but
Yeah.
there is a really important detail in Dawson's findings that we need to highlight.
Mm.
He also identified positive correlations between economic performance and certain types of regulation.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What kind of regulations were those?
These were primarily regulations that support and enforce property rights and contracts.
Okay.
Having a clear and reliable legal system
Right.
where your property is secure and agreements are upheld appears to actually stimulate economic activity.
That makes sense. Businesses here in LaPorte need to know that their investments are protected and that contracts will be honored.
Exactly. And the research even references Hernando de Soto's book, The Mystery of Capital, which argues that clearly defined and protected property rights were fundamental to America's economic development in the 19th century.
Okay.
So Dawson's study offers statistical evidence supporting that idea in today's regulatory landscape.
Now, it's important to remember that this study shows a correlation,
Yeah.
but that doesn't automatically prove that regulation directly causes lower economic growth.
That's a very important distinction.
Right.
While this statistical analysis can't definitively say that regulation is the sole cause, the research also highlights that many economic theories support the idea that free markets tend to produce more prosperity.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, think back to Adam Smith, who argued centuries ago that government restrictions on trade and the creation of monopolies ultimately harm the economy.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, Austrian economists like Mises and Hayek emphasized how government intervention can distort the signals that businesses rely on to make good decisions.
Okay.
Public choice economists have pointed out how regulations can sometimes be influenced by special interests rather than the overall public good, leading to inefficient outcomes.
Yeah.
So these ideas provide a theoretical basis for understanding why we might see the statistical connections Dawson found.
So what has been the general trend in the amount of federal regulation over time based on this CFR page count?
Well, the research shows that the number of pages in the CFR has mostly increased since it began in 1938.
Okay.
There have only been a few temporary drops.
Really?
One notable period was after the 1994 elections, when there was an effort to reduce regulations. And we did see a decline for a few years. However, the overall trend has been toward more regulation, and the study indicates that it's been increasing again in recent times. They even mentioned the Sarbanes-Oxley Act
Okay.
as an example of a regulation that, while intended to address corporate wrongdoing, could potentially make it more difficult for businesses to grow.
You know, it really makes you wonder how these big trends at the federal level are playing out right here in our communities.
Yeah.
For those of you listening in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, have you noticed how increasing federal regulations might be affecting our local businesses, the job market, or the overall economic vitality of our area? For instance, how might changes in environmental regulations impact the operations of our local industries?
Right.
Or how could new labor laws affect hiring practices at small businesses in our neighborhoods?
These are precisely the kinds of questions that residents of Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena should be considering. While this research looks at the broad scope of federal regulation, the underlying principles about how rules can affect economic activity likely have very real consequences at the local level. Understanding these wider trends can help us all be more informed as we discuss and consider policies at all levels of government and their potential impact on our daily lives and the economic health of Southeast Houston.
So, to bring it all together, this deep dive into the research from the Mises Institute suggests a connection between more federal regulation and slower economic productivity and growth. While it's not a black and white cause and effect situation, these findings, along with well-established economic ideas, certainly give us something to think about as we consider the future of our local economy.
Absolutely. And while we focused on federal regulations today, the core ideas about how rules can influence economic activity are relevant to state and even local regulations here in Texas.
Right.
Thinking critically about these dynamics can empower all of you in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena to be more engaged and informed citizens.
Considering this research, what specific federal regulations do you believe might be having the most significant impact, either positive or negative, on the economic well-being of the Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena area? We encourage you to pay attention to the effects of regulations in your own lives and in our local economy. If you find value in this deep dive into understanding the forces shaping our community, please support us at thinkandactlocally.com/donate, link in show notes.